The best thing about The Last of Us show's first episode is that it makes no assumption that the viewer knows anything about the property. While most of what is shown follows the events of the opening sections of the game directly, it also takes the time to provide the required context needed for each of these events clearly. As expected with any adaptation, there are additions and changes in a number of areas, some cosmetic like the races of many of the lead characters, and others plot related like giving Joel's neighbors and daughter Sarah more time and focus than they had in the game. At least from this episode alone, the focus seems geared towards more character interaction as opposed to the brutal action that the game focuses on in between its cutscenes and puzzles. A few character motivations also seem to be shuffled around, like how Roberts in the game is killed by Joel and Tess, which then leads them to have to take over the job of delivering Ellie for Marlene, whereas in the series, Robert dies in an altercation with the Fireflies, and because of that, the job is basically offered to the leads, who take it on in an exchange for a vehicle that they need to reach Tommy. Also in the series version, Joel is worried about Tommy and wants to find him, whereas in the game, Joel was never looking for Tommy from the start. Joel also seems to have some sort of lingering mental issues from remembering the night that he lost his daughter, which plays out in the episode's final sequence in a moment where he kind of gets triggered by something that reminds him of that night, and then he basically loses control and rages out on a federal officer. Also, the origin and the nature of the cordyceps has been modified to allow the actors to not have to wear their masks like they do in the game. That one's more of a Hollywood thing, so I don't think there was really any way of getting around it. I expect there'll be a lot more changes as the show goes on. My predictions is that Ellie's friend Riley and Bill's partner Frank will also receive increased focus, as well as Marlene and the other Fireflies. But I'm hoping it retains or at least surpasses the level that it started at, because I think as far as adaptations go, or the series in general, this is definitely a solid start. My only issue with The Last of Us in general as a franchise is that I feel like it's all, for the most part, been unnecessary. Outside of the original game itself, everything else that's been bolted onto it, and again, this is just subjective opinion, I expect most will disagree. Everything else that's been bolted onto this or that original story has more or less detracted from it. Outside of the original remaster, which basically bolted the Left Behind DLC and the original game together, everything else, from the multiplayer to The Last of Us 2 to this recent Part 1 remaster, they're not bad things. To me, they just seem unnecessary. I feel like what the series needs is a new story, like a genuine new story, preferably, in my opinion, focusing on different characters in a different area completely. Kind of like what The Walking Dead tends to do. The TV series has its characters, the game has its own characters, and they just happen to be in the same world. Anyway, as I mentioned earlier, one of my favorite things about this adaptation is just this one episode. There's still enough time to run this off a cliff. Is that it does not assume that you've played the game or that you know anything about The Last of Us. There is no self-referential dialogue or one-liners that are meant to let you know that they are self-aware that this is based on a video game or that it's adapted from something else. There is no motivations or character moments that rely on external knowledge of the source material and that would have made much less impact if you didn't know about them. One of my greatest pet peeves in modern adaptations is the use of popular IPs to generate interest in a project and then simply using the name as a license to just go ahead and do something else. This in and of itself is not a big problem, but if the writers want to tell a different story with, the world or the characters, I don't think that should be a problem. My issue is that this half-assed attempt to do your own thing is usually what happens, where the adaptation veers far away from the source material while not setting up its own new setting and scenario well enough for it to stand on its own. So it creates this weird halfway point where the new material is very alien to the original series or material, and yet still requires your knowledge of that very material in order to make it work. A case in point is like Zack Snyder's version of the DCEU, which for me to date is the biggest waste of so many talented writers and actors and effects people that I've ever seen put into one location. It's like a huge waste of money and talent. In just 2 movies, the story covers Superman's origins, it references the Dark Knight Returns, the death of Superman, it introduces many Justice League members. Lex Luthor tries to set up, well, I mean, that's in Justice League, where it tries to set up, the Legion of Doom. Each of these events in the source iconography could have been its entire story. And none of them is really set up well enough in the movies as they should. And so in order to fully appreciate the iconography, you are required to have previous knowledge of the material, or else it doesn't work. Batman killing people is supposed to be shocking and show that he's become jaded or he's lost his way, but that only makes sense if you have external knowledge of the character, because it's not set up with Ben Affleck's version of the character. Same with Superman having an issue with killing Zod. Rather than putting in the work in the actual property to establish who these new versions of the characters are, the material just expects you to get how important these moments are based on some sort of cultural osmosis. You're supposed to know Superman doesn't like killing, and therefore, what he's doing here is supposed to be shocking. But it only works under the assumption that you know all those things from external material. This particular version that Cavill is playing does not have that specific personality set up for him. So anyway, my hope for the new Last of Us show is that it stays the current course, and hopefully we can get something more enjoyable within its own right, that can entertain both those with and those without knowledge of, the game or its other material. Of course, my greatest worry with this whole thing is that it's based on The Last of Us, and because of The Last of Us 2's part of the story, it kind of has a built-in self-destruct timer. Once they get to that part of the story, I'm waiting to see what will happen. That should be very interesting.